Welcome to the Global Risk Podcast from Solace Global. This is your weekly global intelligence briefing, covering the key geopolitical and security developments shaping the world. In the Americas, we cover violent clashes in Ecuador as protests over fuel subsidies escalate, and reports that the US is drawing up plans for drone strikes inside Venezuela. In Europe, the Middle East and Africa, we begin with potential unrest in Spain, France and Italy following Israeli raids on the Gaza-bound Sumud flotilla. We also cover new US intelligence support for Ukraine's long-range strikes on Russia, Hezbollah's refusal to disarm in Lebanon, and the likely rejection of a US-backed peace plan by Hamas. We also look at a Houthi missile strike on a Dutch vessel in the Gulf of Aden, youth-led protests in Morocco, and violent unrest in Madagascar. And in Asia-Pacific, we examine the Taliban's nationwide internet blackout in Afghanistan and the devastating 6.9 magnitude earthquake in the Philippines. Expert insight, clear analysis, and the context you need, all in one concise briefing. We begin in the Americas, where protests in Ecuador have escalated into violent clashes following the government's decision to cut fuel subsidies. A national strike, called on September 22nd by Ecuador's largest indigenous rights organization, the Confederation of Indigenous Nationalities of Ecuador, has led to clashes between protesters and security forces. The strike was triggered by President Daniel Noboa's decision to end fuel subsidies, along with plans to expand mining concessions and reopen oil bidding in the Amazon. On the same day, protesters blocked major roads in several provinces. In and around Quito, several routes were disrupted, including Avenida America, the Caixas sector in Cayambe, and parts of the Pan American Highway linking Quito to Sierra. The strikes have led to violent clashes. On September 24th, farmers, indigenous groups, and transport unions clashed with security forces outside Tabacundo. On September 25th, a prison riot broke out, leaving 17 inmates dead. Then on September 28th, one protester was shot dead, and 12 soldiers were injured in clashes in the Andean region north of Quito. More than 80 people were arrested, with 13 now facing terrorism charges. The situation escalated sharply on September 30th, when around 350 protesters attacked a humanitarian convoy led by President Noboa and took 17 soldiers hostage. The convoy, which included UN and EU diplomats, was traveling through Cotacachi in Imbabura province to deliver aid to communities affected by the strike. Following the attack, the military described the assailants as terrorist groups and warned that acts like these will not go unpunished. By October 1st, however, all 17 soldiers had been released. A state of emergency has been declared in 8 of Ecuador's 24 provinces, with a nighttime curfew imposed in 5 of them. President Noboa has claimed that the demonstrations were orchestrated by the Tren de Aragua, a Venezuelan cartel-linked transnational gang, and warned that protesters breaking the law will be charged with terrorism and face 30-year prison sentences. The government has also temporarily relocated the presidency and vice presidency to the cities of Latacunga and Otavalo, where military presence has since been reinforced. Following the attack on the convoy, the protests have begun to subside. On September 30th, the provincial government in Imbabura agreed to open talks with indigenous protesters to bring the demonstrations to an end. By October 1st, the national government announced it was close to signing an agreement with indigenous organizations to formally end the strike. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. The Ecuadorian government has long subsidized fuel to keep domestic prices low, with the policy first introduced in 1974. It was made possible by the country's oil boom in the 1970s, but rising consumption, volatile international oil prices, and growing fiscal strain have made the subsidies increasingly difficult to sustain. Fuel subsidies now account for a large share of public spending, costing around $2.25 billion in 2023. These subsidies have almost certainly limited the government's ability to invest in health, education, infrastructure, and social programs. The government has announced mitigating measures, including direct support for the transport sector, 3 months of compensation for commercial transport, and assurances that the funds will be redirected to other sectors. Protesters, however, view these steps as part of wider austerity measures that are likely to further raise the cost of living. The national strike marks the second phase of unrest, which began after President Noboa announced the immediate removal of the fuel subsidy on September 12th. The first phase of protests broke out on September 16th and spread across the country, prompting the government to impose curfews and deploy the military to reinforce key cities. The Confederation of Indigenous Nationalities of Ecuador has historically played a major role in national politics, particularly in rural and Andean areas. Between 1997 and 2005, it led demonstrations that toppled 3 presidents. More recently, in 2019 and 2022, it successfully organized large-scale protests when the government attempted to eliminate fuel subsidies. While there is a realistic possibility that the government will seek to appease protesters with concessions, President Noboa has insisted that the subsidy cut is irreversible and non-negotiable. The Confederation of Indigenous Nationalities of Ecuador is likely to feel emboldened by its past successes, as well as the current large-scale mobilization against the removal of subsidies. If the government does not address the group's wider demands, including the repeal of Executive Decree 126, a reduction of VAT from 15% to 12%, and a halt to mining and extractive industry expansion, the Confederation of Indigenous Nationalities of Ecuador is expected to call for further strikes, prolonging the unrest. Still in the Americas, reports suggest the U.S. is preparing options for drone strikes inside Venezuela. The U.S. Department of War is said to be drawing up plans for military strikes against narcotics-related targets within Venezuela's borders. The proposals reportedly focus on the use of drones to hit drug traffickers, leadership figures, and laboratories. These plans have not yet received presidential authorization, but inside sources suggest such actions could begin within weeks. The Trump administration is reportedly framing the strikes as a response to Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro's failure to curb drug flows from Venezuela into the United States. Now, our assessment. The plans follow several recent U.S. measures against Venezuela. These include the designation of the Venezuelan origin gang Tren de Aragua as a foreign terrorist organization, an increased reward for information leading to the arrest of President Maduro, and a series of direct threats from the Trump administration. Most critically, they also follow the large-scale deployment of U.S. naval assets to the Caribbean, along with at least 3 U.S. drone strikes against vessels in international waters that were suspected of carrying narcotics from Venezuela. Taken together, these actions suggest that the Trump administration is willing to use lethal force to reduce the flow of drugs into the United States. A shift towards drone strikes inside Venezuelan territory, or even in Venezuelan waters, would mark a major escalation, and would almost certainly draw condemnation from the international community, regional partners, and Venezuela's allies such as Russia, China, and Iran. The United States is likely also exploring alternative measures to pressure President Maduro into curbing the flow of narcotics, including sanctions, diplomacy, and increased interdictions at sea. But if no measurable reduction in drug flows is observed and economic or diplomatic efforts fail, there is a realistic possibility that the Trump administration will authorize lethal force inside Venezuela. The administration has also threatened unilateral military action against drug gangs and cartels in other countries, most notably Mexico. Strikes in Venezuela could serve both as an initial test case and as a strategic message to other nations seen as failing to curb the drug trade into the United States. There are several ways President Maduro could respond to potential U.S. strikes. Limited drone strikes are unlikely to lead to war. Venezuela lacks the conventional military capability to challenge the United States and would likely avoid giving Washington justification for wider operations that could threaten the survival of Maduro's regime. However, any strikes would almost certainly be seen as an attack on Venezuelan sovereignty, likely triggering a rally around the flag response. This could strengthen Maduro's position at home and allow him to further consolidate power, possibly through states of emergency or expanded executive authority. It could also be used as a justification for a crackdown on domestic opposition and foreign influence. Such a scenario would likely see Venezuela move to suppress foreign NGOs or businesses it deems subversive. It would also almost certainly bring a major increase in arbitrary detentions and so-called hostage diplomacy, where foreign nationals, particularly Westerners, could be detained under vague national security charges and used as bargaining chips in future negotiations. The planned strikes could also prompt Venezuela to scale back its counter-narcotics cooperation, or even to leverage Venezuelan gangs operating abroad to apply asymmetric pressure on U.S. interests. Now turning to Europe, the Middle East and Africa, where unrest is highly likely across Spain, France and Italy after Israeli forces raided the Gaza-bound Sumud flotilla. On the night of October 1st into 2nd, Israeli forces intercepted the vessels of the global Sumud flotilla, arresting activists and crew members. The flotilla is the largest so far to attempt to reach the Gaza Strip from southern Europe, made up of more than 40 vessels. Several European Union parliamentarians and political figures from both European and Middle Eastern countries were on board. While reports suggest that most of the flotilla has been stopped, at least 2 vessels were still unaccounted for as of the morning of October 2nd, with one ship reportedly entering Gaza's territorial waters. Multiple protests have been scheduled across Europe between October 2nd and 5th. In Italy, several labour and student unions have announced a second round of general strikes on October 3rd and 4th in support of Palestine. This follows a first wave of demonstrations on September 22nd, which drew tens of thousands of people and led to clashes in Milan. Disturbances in Italy had already begun in the early hours of October 2nd. Following the first reports of the flotilla's interception, local media noted cases of direct action, including blockades at public transport hubs in major cities, as well as an attempted blockade of the port of Genoa. Protests and acts of direct action were also recorded in Spain and France. In Lyon, at least 2 people were arrested after attempting to block the city's ring road. Now for our assessment. Unrest is highly likely to continue across France, Italy and Spain throughout the October 2nd to 5th period, with cities such as Barcelona, Paris, Milan, Genoa and Marseille expected to be particularly affected. As the Sumud Flotilla website carried both a live stream of the vessels and a live tracker of their status and position, it is almost certain that the disturbances seen in the early hours of October 2nd were coordinated by small direct action groups to coincide with the expected time of interception. These actions are likely to continue and expand through October 2nd and 3rd, reaching their peak over the weekend. Of the 3 countries, Italy is expected to be the most affected. This is due to the Italian government's ongoing opposition to recognizing Palestine, as well as the involvement of several Italian MPs in the flotilla. In addition, Italian media outlets have reported a major surge in online calls for violence and sabotage ahead of the planned October 3rd to 4th strike. Back in 2010, a Gaza-bound flotilla was intercepted by the Israeli Defense Forces and the vessels were boarded. On one ship, the Mavi Marmara, which was boarded in international waters, 10 Turkish activists were killed after attempting to resist the boarding. The live streaming of the current flotilla has likely been intended to deter Israel from using force and to prevent it from controlling the narrative in the event of an incident. However, if any violence were to be live-streamed, particularly if it resulted in serious injury or death, it would almost certainly trigger immediate international condemnation, diplomatic fallout, and intensify both current and future unrest. Staying in the region, the United States has approved intelligence support for Ukraine's long-range strikes and is considering sending Tomahawk missiles. On October 2nd, reports confirmed that the Trump administration had approved the sharing of intelligence with Ukraine to support strikes against long-range energy infrastructure targets inside Russia. Washington is further considering the delivery of Tomahawk and Barracuda cruise missiles to Ukraine, although no final decision has yet been made. Earlier reports on September 26th revealed that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky had directly requested Tomahawks from Trump during their recent meetings at the United Nations General Assembly, with Zelensky quoting Trump as saying, "We will work on it." Now our intelligence assessment. Ukrainian forces likely don't need U.S. intelligence to successfully strike most Russian energy infrastructure, as these are static targets that can be easily located through open-source intelligence. Ukraine's aerial campaign against Russia's oil and gas industry, carried out mainly with long-range attack drones, has significantly intensified since August and has almost certainly had a strategic-level impact. Of Russia's 38 large oil refineries, 21 have been hit since the start of 2025. At least 10 of them have either fully or partially suspended operations since August. This has already led to worsening fuel shortages across Russia, although key regions such as Moscow and Krasnodar have so far not been heavily affected. While U.S. intelligence may not be essential for Ukraine to continue striking fixed oil and gas facilities, it almost certainly brings some advantages. First, it sends a strategic message to Moscow that Washington is endorsing Kyiv's campaign, despite the knock-on effects for international markets, and may be an early sign that the U.S. is preparing to provide Ukraine with more advanced long-range weapons. Washington is also highly unlikely to permit Ukraine to use U.S.-supplied systems against targets inside Russia's internationally recognized borders without U.S. approval. That would require American involvement in the targeting process to limit collateral damage and avoid escalation. With U.S. intelligence integrated into the targeting cycle, Ukraine could employ more sophisticated American systems that are both more accurate and more capable of penetrating Russian air defenses. It would also allow Ukraine to refine its targeting, striking the most critical parts of Russia's oil and gas infrastructure to maximize disruption. Moreover, U.S. intelligence support could help Ukraine hit dynamic targets linked to the energy sector, such as tanker convoys, rail operations, or ship-to-ship transfers, which it currently lacks the assets to track effectively. If used effectively, these mechanisms could deliver greater economic disruption, likely increasing pressure on Russia to come to the negotiating table. It is not yet fully clear whether the Pentagon has adjusted its restrictions on the use of its systems against targets inside internationally recognized Russian territory. However, on September 28th, a Russian thermal power plant in Belgorod was struck by Ukrainian forces. Open-source assessments of the attack footage suggest it was carried out with HIMARS. If accurate, such a strike would almost certainly have required Washington's approval. A strong indication that the Pentagon's conditions may already have shifted. The provision of Tomahawk and Barracuda missiles would significantly expand Ukraine's ability to strike high-value targets inside Russian territory. Their use, however, would almost certainly come with the condition of U.S. intelligence involvement. The Tomahawk cruise missile has a range of 2,500 kilometers, giving Ukraine the capability to hit deep into Russian territory with far larger explosive payloads than its current long-range drones can deliver. But Ukraine currently lacks the platforms needed to launch Tomahawks, such as guided missile destroyers or strategic bombers. The only known ground-based launch platform in open sources is the U.S. Typhoon mid-range capability missile system. If Tomahawks were provided, they would likely need to be paired with Typhoon, unless Ukraine were able to engineer improvised ground launch systems, as it has done before with smaller missiles like the Brimstone. It is not yet clear which variants of the Barracuda family could be supplied to Ukraine. The Barracuda range includes both autonomous aerial vehicles, loitering munitions, and medium-range cruise missiles. These systems are very new and remain untested in combat, having been unveiled by Anduril Industries in 2024. A key marketed advantage of the Barracuda line is its rapid production profile. The company claims around 95% fewer tooling requirements and 50% fewer parts than comparable systems, which significantly shortens build times and lowers costs. Those features make Barracuda attractive to Kyiv as a potential source of large volumes of munitions to meet the sustained demands of the Russo-Ukrainian war. From Washington's perspective, deployment would almost certainly be seen as a valuable chance to gather operational data on an emergent system under real combat conditions. An expansion of Ukraine's ability to strike high-value targets in Russia with long-range precision weapons, supported by the US and its allies, will likely provoke further escalation in Moscow's hybrid campaign against NATO members. At the same time, the Kremlin is highly likely to intensify its aerial campaign against Ukraine. The third largest combined wave of strikes of the war so far took place overnight on September 27th into 28th. There is also a realistic possibility that Russia could adapt its targeting threshold, potentially moving to strike sites in Ukraine directly linked to US and European allies. Now turning to the Middle East, where in Lebanon, Hezbollah's leader has rejected calls to disarm, pledging to maintain the group's arsenal. On September 28th, Hezbollah's current Secretary General, Naim Qassem, declared that the Shia militant group would not commit to disarmament while speaking at a rally marking the one-year anniversary of former leader Hassan Nasrallah's assassination in an Israeli strike in southern Beirut. Qassem addressed thousands of Hezbollah supporters gathered at Nasrallah's tomb, alongside senior Iranian officials, including Ali Larijani, Secretary of Iran's Supreme National Security Council. In his speech, Qassem insisted that Hezbollah would never abandon its weapons, would continue to resist any project serving Israel, and dismissed disarmament as nothing more than the dream of the group's enemies, both inside and outside Lebanon. Now our assessment. Hezbollah remains severely weakened after its 2023-24 war with Israel, which saw the deaths of 2 senior leaders, major losses within its command structure, heavy casualties among its fighters, and the destruction of much of its arsenal. The group has also been cut off from its main supply route. With the collapse of the Assad regime in Syria, Hezbollah lost its ground lines of communication from Iran to Lebanon via Syrian territory. At the same time, Hezbollah's main sponsor, Iran, is almost certainly prioritizing its own rearmament following the 12-day Iran-Israel war, leaving Hezbollah with far less external support than in the past. These combined pressures mean Hezbollah is unlikely to pose a credible military threat to Israel in the near term, and a rapid rearmament appears highly unlikely. As a result, the group has likely been forced to scale back its ambitions and adapt its strategy. This shift is expected to move away from conventional military capabilities, such as large rockets and missiles, and instead focus on building a more asymmetric threat. That strategy would center on smaller, more agile units and the use of lighter systems, including tactical uncrewed aerial vehicles, improvised explosive devices, and mobile weapons platforms. There are already early indications that Hezbollah is turning to smuggling networks and boosting local arms production to pursue these goals. Hezbollah's rejection of disarmament comes just weeks after the Lebanese cabinet approved a US-backed phased plan to disarm the group by the end of 2025. The plan, passed in August, calls for the Lebanese armed forces to gradually take control of Hezbollah's weapons, beginning in southern Lebanon, and then expanding northward in multiple phases as part of a wider national security strategy. This strategy could succeed in stripping Hezbollah of its heavier weaponry, such as long-range rockets, guided missiles, and armored vehicles. However, it will almost certainly struggle to disarm the group of its lighter systems, including small arms, uncrewed aerial vehicles, and improvised explosive devices, which can be easily concealed, dispersed, or smuggled. The effort will also be limited by Hezbollah's ability to entrench itself within Shia communities, many of which remain resistant to state intervention. While Hezbollah's direct threat to Israel has been severely reduced, Israel continues to maintain an enhanced force posture along the Lebanese border, with the Israel Defense Forces still occupying 5 strategic locations in southern Lebanon. There is a realistic possibility that any indication of Hezbollah attempting to rearm, in any form, will be seized upon by Israel as justification for further preemptive operations, particularly if a resolution in Gaza allows Israel to shift military resources back to the north. Hezbollah's refusal to fully disarm also raises the risk of internal conflict within Lebanon. External pressure, combined with domestic disarmament efforts and political dynamics shaped by fragile sectarian relations and weak state institutions, is highly likely to deepen tensions and increase the risk of instability, unrest, and violence. Meanwhile, in Gaza, Hamas is expected to reject a newly proposed US-backed ceasefire plan. On September 29th, US President Donald Trump announced that Israeli officials had agreed to a plan to end the nearly 2-year conflict in the Gaza Strip. The proposal still requires approval from Hamas. The plan calls for the demilitarization of Gaza and the disarmament of Hamas, along with the immediate release of all hostages in exchange for more than 1,000 Palestinians currently held in Israeli prisons. It also includes amnesty for Hamas members who pledged to follow the peace process, a surge in humanitarian aid to the enclave, an Israeli pledge not to annex Gaza or strike Qatar again, and the creation of a new administration to replace Hamas. Under the proposal, Gaza would be governed for up to 5 years by an international body, the Gaza International Transitional Authority, with security overseen by a coalition of regional powers. GITA would eventually prepare the ground for the West Bank-based Palestinian Authority to assume unified control of the Strip. Importantly, Palestinians would not be forced to leave Gaza under this plan. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has voiced support for the proposal. However, members of the far-right parties that underpin his fragile coalition have raised objections. Many of them continue to push instead for full Israeli annexation of Gaza and the expulsion of its population. For its part, Hamas has yet to issue a formal response. Representatives based in Qatar have said they will study the proposal for several days before replying. But initial reporting suggests that Hamas's leadership inside Gaza, headed by Izz al-Din al-Haddad, is likely to reject the plan. Now our assessment. The proposed ceasefire plan would fully deliver on Israel's first declared objective in Gaza, the release of the hostages. While it would not destroy Hamas outright, it would remove the group from power and force its disarmament, effectively meeting Israel's second stated war goal. However, the far-right parties that sustain Prime Minister Netanyahu's government are likely to remain partly opposed to the plan. Their ambitions go much further, calling for the annexation of Gaza, the construction of Israeli settlements there, and the expulsion of the Palestinian population. Netanyahu likely calculates that growing public opposition to prolonging the war and the risk this poses to the 20 surviving hostages will pressure his far-right coalition partners into backing the ceasefire rather than triggering a political crisis that could end in new elections. Hamas has been significantly weakened over the course of the 2-year conflict, and recent reports suggest the group now suffers from a lack of strategic clarity, with growing divisions between its leadership in Gaza and its representatives in Qatar. Despite the heavy losses, Hamas leaders inside Gaza almost certainly hold the most leverage, primarily because they control the remaining Israeli hostages. Meanwhile, Hamas's senior leadership abroad has been decimated and has almost certainly suffered from the collapse of the Iran-led Axis of Resistance in 2025. As a result, near-term decision-making is highly likely to rest with the Gaza-based leadership. For them, several elements of the ceasefire plan are almost certainly unacceptable, most notably the requirement to disarm, which would strip them of control over the population, subordination to the Palestinian Authority, and the introduction of the foreign-led GITA framework. Taken together, these factors make a Hamas rejection of the plan the most likely outcome. Moving on to the Gulf of Aden, where Houthi forces have struck a Dutch-flagged cargo vessel with an anti-ship missile. On September 29th, the Dutch-flagged general cargo ship MV Minerva-Gracht was hit by a suspected anti-ship missile while transiting east through the Gulf of Aden. 2 crew members were injured, and 19 others were evacuated by helicopter to Djibouti after a fire disabled the ship. With the decision taken to abandon her, the vessel is now adrift in the Gulf. This was not the first incident involving the Minerva-Gracht. On September 23rd, the vessel reported an explosion just 2 nautical miles away while transiting west through the same waters. At the time, assessments suggested the ship was not the intended target, as it had little visible connection to Israel. However, the Houthis have claimed responsibility for the September 29th strike. They said the vessel was hit with an anti-ship cruise missile because its owner had violated what they described as the entry ban to the ports of occupied Palestine. Now our team's assessment. The follow-up attack and Houthi statements strongly indicate that the Minerva-Gracht was almost certainly the intended target. After a port call in Djibouti, the vessel had abandoned its planned Red Sea transit and rerouted east through the Gulf of Aden, sailing with its automatic identification system switched off. Despite this, it was still struck by a standoff weapon, an anti-ship cruise missile. This suggests the Houthis were able to track the ship's hull independently of AIS, and that going AIS dark, or reducing electronic signatures, does not guarantee protection once a vessel of interest has been identified. The Gulf of Aden is a heavily congested sea lane with variable weather, shifting sea states, and a crowded radio frequency environment. All of these factors make target acquisition more difficult and increase the risk of misidentification or accidental targeting. A ship transiting the area, even at a relatively low cruising speed of 10 knots, can quickly move beyond the stale coordinates initially fed into a missile system. This places it outside the missile's search basket, the small area where its onboard seeker expects to detect and lock onto the intended target. That the Houthis were able to dynamically target an AIS dark vessel strongly suggests they now have near-continuous tracking and targeting data available through their intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance network in the Gulf of Aden. This capability would allow them to feed in mid-course updates to their missiles as the target moved. Without such a system, the risk of striking vessels linked to countries like Saudi Arabia would rise sharply, an outcome the Houthis are almost certainly keen to avoid in order to limit the chances of escalation. Given the distance from shoreline areas controlled by the Houthis, this tracking was likely achieved through the use of long-endurance uncrewed aerial vehicles, spotters placed on civilian profile vessels, or more sophisticated external intelligence support, such as signals intelligence provided by partners like Iran's Revolutionary Guards. The strike on the Minerva-Gracht is likely the first successful Houthi attack in the Gulf of Aden since July 2024. It strongly suggests that the lull in incidents was not the result of the Houthis losing their anti-shipping capabilities in the area. Early indications suggest that the Minerva-Gracht and its operator, the Amsterdam-based Spleethoff Group, have no verified recent links to Israel. The vessel had not made any recent port calls in Israel, nor carried any declared Israeli-linked cargo. Its owner is also not known to have any direct ties to Israel. However, the Joint Maritime Information Center has said this assessment is still under review. There remains a realistic possibility that a more detailed intelligence review could identify indirect or tenuous connections, such as historic port calls, ownership structures, or insurance links. The Houthis have previously used such factors to justify their targeting decisions, and may again leverage them to rationalize future strikes on vessels with only limited or indirect connections to Israel. In North Africa, youth-led protests in Morocco have escalated into the country's largest demonstrations in years. Since September 27th, demonstrations have spread across several cities, with young protesters demanding better education, employment opportunities, and healthcare, accusing the government of failing to provide adequate funding. Chants at the rallies have included, "We want hospitals, not stadiums," and "The people want an end to corruption." The protests have been organized by an anonymous online youth group calling itself Gen Z 212, which has mobilized supporters through platforms such as Discord, TikTok, and Instagram. The demonstrations began relatively peacefully in cities including Rabat, Marrakesh, and Casablanca. But on September 30th, they escalated into violent clashes in Tiznit, Inzagane, Ait Amira, Oujda, and Tamara. In Ait Amira and Inzagane, protesters set several police vehicles on fire and burned down a bank. In Tiznit and Oujda, demonstrators clashed with security forces by throwing stones. Security forces responded forcefully, arresting nearly 200 people and deploying water cannon in several cities. Notably, in Oujda, a protester was struck by a police minivan, with footage of the incident circulating widely across social media. Protests continued on October 1st in several cities, including Agadir, Rabat, Tétouan, Tangier, Casablanca, and Marrakesh. In El Kliaa, near Agadir, at least 2 people were killed after security forces allegedly opened fire on protesters attempting to raid the Royal Gendarmerie Centre. According to local reports, demonstrators were trying to seize weapons, ammunition, and equipment belonging to the gendarmerie. The government issued a statement saying it listens to and understands the social demands of the protesters, and that it is ready to respond positively and responsibly in order to find a solution. Now, our intelligence team's assessment. These protests, Morocco's largest in years, come amid widespread youth frustration over unemployment, education, and healthcare. According to the National Statistics Agency, overall unemployment stands at 12.8%, while youth unemployment is 35.8%, and nearly 1 in 5 graduates are without work. Demonstrators have focused their anger on a government seen as neglecting public services, while at the same time investing billions into football infrastructure ahead of hosting the 2025 Africa Cup of Nations and co-hosting the 2030 FIFA World Cup. The immediate catalyst for the unrest was the deaths of 8 pregnant women in the maternity ward of a public hospital in Agadir following caesarean operations in September. The tragedy initially sparked smaller-scale protests, which have since grown nationwide. According to the World Health Organization, Morocco has fewer than 8 doctors per 10,000 people, well below the recommended 25. The government's appeal for dialogue is unlikely to calm protesters in the short term. The unrest is more likely the culmination of years of public frustration over neglected services, a situation that cannot be quickly fixed. In its statement, the government also defended the security forces' crackdown, praising what it called the balanced reaction of security authorities in line with relevant legal procedures. This is highly likely to reinforce protesters' claims of government corruption, particularly as footage of the police van incident continues to circulate on social media. The deaths of protesters on October 1st will almost certainly add to public anger and are likely to sustain the civil unrest in the days ahead. The Gen Z 212 movement, which only emerged 2 weeks ago, has already gained rapid traction across social media. The 212 almost certainly refers to Morocco's country code, a sign that organizers see themselves as part of a wider youth-driven movement. These demonstrations share key traits with other Gen Z-led protests across the region. mobilization through online platforms, an explicitly leaderless structure, and no formal ties to political parties. These protests are highly likely to have been inspired by similar youth movements, including the recent unrest in Nepal that forced a government resignation, as well as ongoing mobilization in Africa, most notably in Kenya, and more recently Madagascar. It is highly likely that this global surge in youth-led protest movements will drive further civil unrest across other African countries, where frustrations over unemployment and the rising cost of living are being felt most sharply by Generation Z. And in Madagascar, violent anti-government protests have prompted the president to dissolve parliament. On September 25th, demonstrations erupted in Antananarivo over ongoing water and electricity cuts. The protests were led mostly by young people, with no senior political figures reported among the crowds. Looting has been reported, and the homes of politicians have been attacked. Some foreign businesses, including a Chinese-owned shopping mall, were also targeted, though this appears almost certainly opportunistic. So far, there have been no reports of protesters deliberately targeting foreign travelers or expatriates. Protests continued over the weekend, marking the largest wave of unrest in Madagascar in recent years. According to UN officials, at least 22 people have been killed and more than 100 injured. The Malagasy government, however, has rejected these figures. A nightly curfew has been in place since September 25th, running from 8 p.m. to 4 a.m. local time. In response to the unrest, President Andry Rajoelina dismissed the energy minister on September 26th and dissolved parliament on September 29th, promising to appoint a new prime minister within 3 days. Protest organizers said they were very disappointed with the president's speech and have called for further demonstrations. Meanwhile, opposition leader Rivo Rakotovao has announced that his party will not join any government led by President Rajoelina. Civil unrest continued on September 30th, with demonstrators gathering at the University of Mahajanga before marching towards the city centre. In Antananarivo, local media reported that police used tear gas and stun grenades to disperse crowds in Ambohijatovo Park, a central protest site. Protesters returned to the same location on October 1st, but security forces successfully dispersed them. Demonstrations also spread to Toliara, around 925 kilometers south of the capital. On top of this, further widespread power outages were reported in Antananarivo and its surrounding suburbs on September 30th. While Madagascar's main airport remains open, numerous flights have been cancelled, and access roads have been intermittently blocked. The U.S. Department of State has advised its citizens to shelter in place and raised its travel advisory to level 3. Reconsider travel. Meanwhile, the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office is advising against all but essential travel. Now, our assessment: Madagascar remains one of the world's poorest countries. According to a 2022 World Bank report, more than 75% of the population lives below the poverty line. Poverty rates have stayed high over the past decade, with only a slight decrease in rural areas, while urban poverty has nearly doubled. Many households face overlapping hardships, from poor healthcare and education to inadequate sanitation and infrastructure. The economic crisis is further compounded by Madagascar's high vulnerability to environmental risks, including cyclones and droughts. Damage from 4 tropical storms in 2022 alone was estimated to have cost the country as much as 5% of its GDP. The protests in Madagascar fit into the wider pattern of Gen Z-led movements across Africa. Social media has been central, used to mobilize crowds, coordinate meeting points, and share live updates from the ground. The absence of political figures among the demonstrators underlines the grassroots nature of the movement. Notably, many protesters carried the straw hat Jolly Roger symbol, also widely used in the recent Nepalese protests that forced the government to resign. Its appearance in Madagascar points to a broader Gen Z-driven sentiment, and possibly to a more radical intent to push for the overthrow of the government. The government's handling of the demonstrations, particularly the security forces' use of force, is highly likely to be seen as excessive. If footage emerges on social media showing live ammunition being used against protesters, it could significantly inflame the unrest. Meanwhile, the continued power outages, the original spark for the demonstrations, are likely to further galvanize public anger. The rhetoric of protest organizers now reflects a broader anti-government sentiment, raising the risk that demonstrations could escalate towards more radical objectives. Criticism of President Rajoelina by opposition parties almost certainly increases the pressure on him to resign. This is also likely to become the protesters' central demand, meaning the unrest will probably continue unless the president steps down. Finally, in Asia-Pacific, the Taliban has imposed a nationwide internet blackout in Afghanistan, severely disrupting humanitarian operations. On the 29th of September, the Taliban ordered a complete shutdown of internet and mobile telecommunications across the country until further notice. Some sources reported that the regime intends to build or maintain segmented internal networks for government or vetted use while restricting broader public access. The nationwide suspension followed earlier cuts in several provinces earlier in September and was imposed under what the Taliban described as a campaign to prevent immorality by blocking access to content it deems unacceptable. Multiple reports suggest the order came directly from the group's supreme leader, Hibatullah Akhundzada, with the provincial restrictions quickly expanded to a full national blackout. The suspension limited access to Afghan media outlets broadcasting from abroad, such as the London-based Afghanistan International TV, and disrupted flights from Kabul International Airport. Airline communications, check-in services, and flight planning systems were all degraded, causing widespread delays and cancellations. The blackout drew heavy international condemnation, and connectivity was restored on the 1st of October. Now our team's assessment. The suspension of communication networks and the restriction of access to the outside world have become an established tactic of the Taliban government. In 2024, the Taliban was accused of jamming satellite signals in Kabul to limit access to foreign-based satellite TV. Localized phone and internet shutdowns have been a recurring tactic since the Taliban returned to power in 2021. These earlier provincial cuts were potentially indicative of a phased plan that reached maturation on September 29th. While the Taliban claimed the recent blackout was intended to curb immorality, it was more likely imposed to block access to potentially seditious information, including opposition narratives, and to censor content that could undermine regime stability or draw unwanted international scrutiny. Unlike earlier localized shutdowns, this nationwide blackout marks a clear escalation, signaling a more deliberate strategy to suppress dissent, restrict oversight from abroad, and limit access to external sources of information. The UN mission in Afghanistan immediately called on the Taliban to restore internet and telecommunications nationwide, warning of severe humanitarian and economic impacts, particularly for women and girls. The UN, along with multiple NGOs, also cautioned that the blackout would severely hinder the planning, coordination, and delivery of humanitarian aid. The shutdown immediately disrupted efforts to assist remote communities hit by the September earthquake, including the ability to contact frontline staff, an impact made worse by the onset of winter conditions. The Taliban's decision to restore the internet was likely influenced, at least in part, by international pressure, after both foreign governments and NGOs condemned the blackout. Although it lasted only 2 days, the impact was significant, and there is a realistic possibility that the Taliban could turn this into a recurring tactic. Communications may be suspended episodically during periods of heightened rebel activity, civil unrest, or in response to any perceived threat to the regime. Future nationwide blackouts are likely to trigger, or worsen a wide range of existing problems across Afghanistan, where an estimated 23 million people already rely on aid. Economically, the impact would almost certainly be severe, leading to a further deterioration in the humanitarian situation. Banking, e-commerce, payroll systems, and remittance flows from the Afghan diaspora abroad would all be significantly disrupted. Aviation and other forms of transport would become harder to plan and coordinate, while essential services such as education and healthcare would almost certainly feel both the direct and indirect effects of these shutdowns. The Taliban likely imposed the blackout in part to address security concerns. The outage probably reduced digital tracking of senior Taliban figures, complicated the detection of foreign terrorists entering Afghanistan, limited foreign intelligence collection, and disrupted the ability of rebel forces to plan and coordinate attacks. However, it also reduced the Taliban's own situational awareness and hampered crisis communications. Looking ahead, such blackouts could be exploited by hostile actors to carry out attacks or engage in criminal activity with far less monitoring, risks that would only grow if similar suspensions are reimposed. And in the Philippines, a powerful 6.9 magnitude earthquake has caused widespread devastation on Cebu Island. On the 30th of September, the quake struck at a depth of 10 kilometers, about 11 kilometers east-southeast of Calapay. Shaking was felt across the Visayas Islands in the central Philippines. The epicenter was just 21 kilometers northeast of Bogo City, leading to moderate to heavy shaking there and light to moderate shaking in Cebu City. So far, at least 72 people have been confirmed dead, and 294 others injured. The worst devastation, and most of the fatalities, were in northern Cebu, close to the epicenter, particularly in Bogo City, Medellin, and San Remigio. In San Remigio, for example, a sports complex collapsed, killing several people who had been playing basketball inside. In Bogo City, the local hospital was quickly overwhelmed, while power outages and heavy rainfall made disaster response even more difficult. Local authorities have declared a state of calamity in parts of Cebu, and relief operations are still underway. Now, our assessment: the Philippines is almost certainly one of the most vulnerable countries in the world to natural disasters. Firstly, its geographical position leaves it exposed to frequent tropical storms and typhoons, while sitting within the Pacific Ring of Fire makes it highly prone to seismic activity. In 2023, a 7.6 magnitude earthquake killed at least 3 people and injured 79. The year before, a magnitude 7 quake left 5 dead and 60 injured. But the 30th of September, Cebu earthquake stands out as one of the deadliest quakes the Philippines has faced in years. Secondly, the Philippines struggles with poor disaster resilience. A country's disaster resilience, shaped by factors like preparedness, infrastructure quality, building standards, and emergency response capacity, is a critical determinant of how severe a natural disaster's impact will be. Because of the Philippines' extreme exposure to natural hazards, combined with this low resilience, the country is frequently cited as the most disaster-prone nation in the world. On 21 September, mass nationwide protests broke out in the Philippines over corruption in disaster resiliency projects, particularly flood defenses. Around 60,000 people are estimated to have demonstrated in Metro Manila. The country is also still recovering from 2 recent tropical cyclones, both of which caused extensive flooding and fatalities across the country. The devastation caused by the earthquake and the clear limitations in disaster response will likely further galvanize the protest movement, with more demonstrations expected in Philippine cities in the coming weeks. That concludes this week's Global Intelligence Briefing. These updates are part of our Global Intelligence subscription, which includes weekly reports, in-depth briefings, and live Q&A sessions with our experts. To learn more, visit solisglobal.com. Thank you for listening.